Chicago was built twice, and the second time was a lid. In the 1850s, the whole city was jacked up on screws and rebuilt on top of itself, burying the first Chicago alive under several feet of new ground. One man, a retired sewer worker named Hiram Cole, was the last person still alive who had walked those buried streets. When a tunnel caved in near the river, the city called him back down, because the old maps lived in his head and nowhere else. What he found past the old brick was not on any map, because the men who drew the maps had agreed never to put it down. There is a silence only the men who worked under Chicago ever heard. Hiram Cole carried it in him for 30 years, down in the sewer mains and the forgotten freight lines that most of the city pretends don't exist. And by the end, he was the only one left who could still name what that silence was hiding. Sit somewhere with the lights on for this one. We're going down into one of the most disturbing stories the tunnels under Chicago have ever kept silent. And if you want to keep this kind of content alive, the link to my ebook is in the description and the pinned comment, because your support is what lets these stories get told at all. Hyram was 63, and he'd been retired 5 years. He was a sewer maintenance foreman who'd spent his whole working life below the streets, gaunt in the way men get who've breathed damp clay air for decades, with deep-set eyes and hands that remembered every junction in the dark. He was the last of his kind. By the time Hiram quit, the generation that had worked the old underground by hand, the way his father had before him, was down to one man, and the crews below him now used cameras and remote cutters and knew the maps only on a screen. His father had walked those tunnels before him. The old man spent 30 years below the streets too, and he taught Hyram that the ground under Chicago is an empty space. It's a second city laid on its side, and a man who works down there is always walking through someone's old front room. That first city is the part most people don't know about. Chicago was built on swamp, low and flat against Lake Michigan, with clay soil that drank almost no water and let almost none of it run away. And for 2 decades after the town was founded, the rain had nowhere to go. It pooled into standing, sick water. That water bred cholera and typhoid and dysentery year after year. And in 1854, an outbreak killed 6% of everyone living there, which was the year the city stopped pretending the ground would fix itself. The fix was a sewer plan, drawn in 1856. An engineer named Ellis Chesbro designed it, and the only way to make it drain was to lift the whole city above it, so they raised Chicago, jacking the buildings up on screws and laying pipe and covering the old streets with several feet of new soil to pave on top. They didn't tear the first city down. They buried it, pouring fill over the old streets and paving a new city on top, a few feet higher, with the old ground floor left intact underneath in the dark, and that buried first floor is still down there now. They raised whole blocks this way while the businesses inside stayed open. In 1860, a consortium including George Pullman lifted half a block on Lake Street, 320 feet of 4- and 5-story brick, something like 35,000 tons, and raised it nearly 5 feet in 5 days with 6,000 jackscrews turned by 600 men. People shopped and worked in those buildings while they went up. The next year, they raised the Tremont House Hotel 6 feet with 1,000 jackscrews, and a guest sleeping there complained the front steps got steeper every day, until by checkout the windows were above his head. Old wooden buildings they just put on rollers. They rolled them down the street to the edge of town, and a traveler back then wrote that he met 9 houses moving on a single day, with people still eating dinner inside them as the buildings rolled past. So there's a Chicago below Chicago. A whole first floor of the city sits entombed in the dark, and Seattle did the same thing on its waterfront, which is why you can still walk a buried Seattle underground today. But Hyram walked the Chicago one. Hyram went down first in the 1960s. He was a young man then, and the crews still cut into the old buried grade by hand, and he learned those streets the way a cab driver learns the grid. Doorways and lintels and pre-raising alleys that still ran under the fill. The buried streets still have their doorways. Some of the lintels are down there still, under the fill, and old cellar hatches and the bases of gas lamps and shop fronts that were just built over instead of torn down. So a man walking the old grade is walking the ground floor of a city the new city paved across the top of. Down there the brick has a smell the new tunnels don't. It's the smell of clay that hasn't dried in 100 years, mixed with lamp oil and old sewage and the faint iron taste of water that's been sitting in the dark since before your grandfather was born, and once you know it, it never leaves your nose. This channel treats these as legends, not city records. Chicago keeps its underground quiet the way the mountains keep theirs, and the stories that come out of it ride on real brick and real clay, which is what makes them hard to dismiss and hard to prove, and that's exactly the ground this one is built on. He knew which turns the old maps marked wrong. Some of them were wrong on purpose, and that was the part nobody else knew, because Hiram had a map in his head of the places the official maps left blank, and he'd never told anyone what was in those blank spaces. He never said why he stopped going down. He only said he was done, and he kept that promise to himself for 5 years, until the night the phone rang, and the city told him a tunnel had caved in near the river, and the men down there wouldn't go past a certain wall. The call came from a foreman named Dale. Hiram had trained him, and Dale now ran the downtown crew, and he wouldn't pretend everything was fine, because a section of the old freight tunnels had collapsed within sight of the river and his men had bricked it off once already, and the brick wasn't holding. The maps didn't match what they were finding. Dale needed someone who remembered the tunnels before they were sealed, and there was only one man alive who did, so he called his old teacher out of retirement for one last trip down. The tunnels had a character of their own. They were egg-shaped and low, just 7.5 feet at the crown, so a tall man had to duck at the curves. And they ran in a soft blue clay that held them the way a fist holds a candle, and once you'd been down in them long enough, you could feel when the clay was listening. The freight tunnels are the other Chicago underground, the one even the city tried to forget. Starting in 1899, a company dug roughly 60 miles of narrow-gauge railway tunnel beneath downtown, a 2-foot track laid to haul coal and freight and mail between the basements of the loop, and the service opened in 1906. The tunnels were never famous. The company went broke and shut them down by 1959, and the tracks came out and the assets sold at auction for $64,000. But the tunnels themselves were left down there, 40 feet under the streets, still carrying power and cable lines, and most of the city stopped thinking about them. For decades, the tunnels drew urban explorers. People would sneak down through forgotten basement hatches just to walk the old narrow gauge, until the early 2000s, when a man named Joseph Konopka used the underground to stash chemicals and the city locked every access down for good. After that, the tunnels became a place you only entered with keys and permission and a reason the city would put on paper. The city forgot them so completely it forgot its own basements were hooked up to them. In late 1991, a crew drove new wooden pilings into the riverbed near the Kinzie Street Bridge to keep barges off the bridge, and the pilings cracked the old tunnel wall right under the river, and nobody panicked at first because nobody remembered the tunnels went anywhere. There had been a warning before that, and the city had ignored it too. Back in 1959, an excavation punctured the tunnel, and a crew fought a desperate, successful battle to keep the river out of the system. And the lesson didn't stick, because by 1992 nobody even remembered the tunnel was there to puncture. Then in April of 1992, the slow leak opened into a clear hole. 250 million gallons of river water poured down into the system and came up through the basements of buildings that had no idea they were still connected. Fish swam in the basement of the merchandise mart before dawn, and the Federal Reserve flooded, and downtown shut down for days at a cost of roughly $2 billion. Hiram had worked that aftermath. He'd been one of the men down in the dark after the flood, pumping and sealing and finding connections the maps had quietly lost. And if a city could forget 250 million gallons of water pouring through its own basement, it could forget anything. That was the year he decided he was close to done. He told Dale he'd come down one last time, and he told his wife only that it was a survey job, and he didn't tell her about the wall the crew wouldn't pass, because he wasn't sure yet what to tell her about it himself. He packed his old gear the way he had for 30 years. Heavy canvas coat, rubber boots, the same helmet lamp he'd carried since the 1980s, and a notebook he'd kept against the day the city admitted the maps were wrong. He told himself on the drive in that he was only going to look, that he'd be up by lunch, that there was nothing down there a retired man hadn't seen before. He went down at 4 in the morning. He wanted to be below before the traffic above could shake dust into the shaft, so he took a hard hat and a lamp and a radio that worked on the main lines. He descended through the working sewers first, the big mains that still carry the city's water, and then through a locked gate into the older freight system where the air changes. The smell down there isn't rot, it's clay and old concrete and the faint mineral taste of water that's been sitting in the dark for a century, and Hiram knew it the way you know a room you grew up in, by feel, before you ever put a name to it. The freight tunnels were dug by hand through a seam of soft blue clay. That clay runs under the whole loop, and it's the reason the tunnels held, because the standard tunnel was egg-shaped, 7.5 feet high and 6 feet wide, with walls 10 inches thick, cut out of the clay with modified draw knives and lined with coarse concrete. Some sections were dug under pressure. The crews sealed the heading and pumped it to 10 pounds per square inch to keep the river out, and the men inside worked in air thick enough to ring in their ears, coming up slow on the lock so the pressure wouldn't bend them, and a few of the old diggers never came up right at all. The city made the company dig deep. They had to go no shallower than 22.5 feet below the pavement to leave room for a streetcar subway that never came, so the tunnel sat about 40 feet down, drained by 71 electric pumps, and ventilated by nothing but the push of the old trains. The first 16 miles of it were dug in secret. The company had permission for telephone cable tunnels, not a railway, and they didn't want the city asking questions, so they worked out of the basement of a saloon and hauled the spoil away after midnight, cart by cart, while the streets above slept. He'd loved that detail. It meant the underground of Chicago was born lying, and it had been lying ever since. So a man who worked down there had to learn to read the ground instead of the paperwork, because the paperwork was never the whole truth. He walked the line by memory. He named the grand unions where 2 tunnels crossed beneath a street intersection. The junctions laid out tight enough that the curves were only 16 feet in radius, and his feet found them without his having to think, the way a man's feet find the stairs in his own house. The grand unions were the marvel of the system. Where 2 tunnels crossed beneath an intersection, the trackwork branched in every direction at once. A small iron forest of frogs and crossings set into the concrete floor, and Hiram had loved them as a young man because they were the only place down there that looked designed by someone who'd taken pride in the work. He'd been down here first as a 20-year-old. An old man named Walter had shown him the ropes then, a hand who'd worked the tunnels since before the abandonment. And Walter had taught him which turns to take and which to avoid, and which blank spaces on the maps were blank because the men who drew them had agreed to leave them that way. Hiram had laughed that off at 20. He'd stopped laughing it off by 40, and he stopped believing it was a joke altogether the night Walter went down a spur near the river and came back up with his hands shaking and never said a word about what he'd seen. And Walter wasn't a man whose hands shook. Walter quit within a month of that night. He turned in his lamp and his keys and wouldn't say where he'd gone or what he'd seen, only that there were parts of the underground a man didn't go. Hiram had filed it away as an old man's scare story, and he thought about it now, standing at the broken wall, and he didn't think it was a scare story anymore. There was one stretch Hiram remembered as bricked shut. It was a spur off a Grand Union near the river that the maps showed ending in a wall. And he came around the curve expecting the wall, and the wall was gone. The brick knocked through, not recently, and beyond it the air moved the wrong way. He keyed the radio to tell Dale what he was seeing. The radio gave him back nothing but static, and under the static there was a sound like breathing in a pipe, and the air coming through the broken wall was warm and slow, and carried something older than clay. The collapse was 100 yards further on. A ceiling of modern brick had fallen in under the weight of something above, and Hiram picked through it with his lamp, and the broken brick was the newest thing in the passage, maybe 50 years old, maybe less. Behind the collapse, the wall changed. Where the freight tunnel should have kept going in egg-shaped concrete, the wall was stone instead, hand-dressed blocks fitted dry without mortar, and the stone was older than anything the tunnel company had ever built. Older by a margin that made Hiram stop walking. The dressing on the blocks was too fine for the tunnel company. Their work was rough concrete and utility brick fast and cheap, but this was hand-dressed limestone, each block shaped to fit its neighbor, the kind of cutting that took time and a reason, and whoever had built it hadn't been in a hurry to move freight. He put his hand on it, and the block was warm. That made no sense 40 feet under a city in November, and the air here didn't move like tunnel air, which pushes in one direction from the pumps. It moved in slow pulses, as if the passage behind the stone were breathing on its own. The warmth got stronger as he moved along the wall. It came through the stone the way heat comes through a church wall in summer, stored and slow, and there was no source for it that a sewer man could account for. No steam main, no power conduit, nothing on the plans that ran hot. His lamp flickered once and steadied. He told himself it was the batteries, the way a man down there always tells himself it's the batteries, because the alternative isn't a thought you want to hold for long when you're alone below a city and your radio has gone dead. He marked the wall with a streak of chalk as he went. It was an old habit. Chalk invicted the walls so you could find your way back, and he chalked every third block, and the chalk held, and that was the one thing down here that behaved the way it was supposed to. He tried the radio again and got the same low static. He understood then that he was past the edge of the system the city admitted to, because the official map stopped at the bricked wall he'd already come through, and beyond this stone there was no map, because no one had ever filed one. He wasn't lost in the usual sense. He knew exactly where he was in the grid of the streets above, but the ground under the grid had stopped matching the paper, and that's a different kind of lost. The kind where the world you're standing in has quietly stopped being the world you were told about. He was below the freight tunnels now, and still dropping. The passage was descending toward the old buried grade of the first city, the ground floor they'd paved over in the 1850s, and below that grade, according to everything the city had ever written down, there was nothing at all. Only clay and lake water and the bones of the swamp. A shift in the rubble behind him settled the brick a foot lower. The way back narrowed but didn't close, so he wasn't trapped, not yet, but the exit was no longer something he could take for granted. And the difference between those two things is where a careful man starts making different choices. He could turn around right there. He could climb out and tell Dale the passage was unstable, and that would be the truth, and it would be the end of his last trip, and he would go to his grave never knowing what the warm stone was doing 40 feet under Chicago. He went forward instead. The stone passage turned and began to descend, dropping below the 40-foot level where the freight tunnels lived, down toward the buried grade of the first city, and whatever lay under it, and the blocks got rougher as he went, less like engineering, and more like something cut to fit a shape the cutter had in mind. The warm air thickened until he could taste it. He'd spent 30 years reading the ground under Chicago, and the ground was telling him now that the city above him had been built on top of something the city had never named, and that the something was close, and that he was walking toward it whether he meant to or not. The passage opened out as it went down. The ceiling lifted, the walls drew back, and the air moved freer, and Hiram had the feeling, hard to shake, that the passage was making room for him, the way a throat opens when it's about to speak. The passage leveled into a small fitted stone chamber. It was a turning room barely wider than the tunnel, and set into the far wall was a door, iron once, now so corroded it looked like wet rock, and it stood a few inches ajar. The surface of the door was carved, not stamped. Symbols ran across it in asymmetrical bands that Hyram had never seen in any trademark or surveyor's glyph or utility company stamp in 30 years underground, and they'd been cut deep by a hand that wanted them to last. The symbols weren't any alphabet he knew. They weren't the surveyor's marks the tunnel company used, and they weren't the utility stencils the city sprayed on the mains, and they weren't anything carved by a man who expected his work to be read by the living, because the bands ran in a direction that didn't care about the eye standing in front of them. He stood the lamp forward, and the beam caught the carvings. The symbols threw moving shadow across the iron, and behind the gap of the door there was a glow, faint and warm, the only color in the dark that wasn't brown or black, and it didn't flicker when his lamp did. It wasn't electric light, and it wasn't firelight either. It was the color of an ember held under ash, slow and steady, and it threw a thin, warm line across the stone floor that reached toward his boots, as if the room behind the door were leaning out to look at him. He'd seen a lot of dark in 30 years. He'd seen tunnels full of standing water, and tunnels full of rats, and one tunnel full of a smell that turned out to be a dead deer, washed in through a storm grate. But he'd never seen a dark that had a color in it. This dark had one, the color of a held breath about to be let out. He stood in the doorway the way a man stands when he can't decide. Gaunt and frozen mid-step, the flashlight thrust out in the dark behind him, he held that position for a long count, and he didn't go in, and he didn't go back, because both choices had a weight he could feel in his chest. His hand was steady on the lamp. That was the thing he checked, the way a man checks his pulse, and his hand was steady, and his breathing was steady, and only the part of him that knew what a sealed door in a dead tunnel meant wasn't steady at all. The lock was shattered. He could see where the bolt had been, broken clean, and the rust on the break was old, which meant the door had been forced open a long time ago and then shut again and left, by someone who'd changed their mind about opening it. The break on the bolt was clean, not rusted through. Someone had struck it off, hard, with a tool, and then someone else had shut the door again and wedged it and walked away, and Hiram could read the two acts in the metal, the way a tracker reads two sets of prints going opposite ways in the same mud. There were marks on the inside of the frame as well as the outside. He read that the way he read the tunnels, which is to say something had wanted out and something else had wanted it back in, and the second something had won, and then both of them had gone and left the door to hold the line between them. That was the part that didn't fit a utility story. Utility doors get locked and forgotten. They don't get forced open and then resealed from the outside by a second party, and they don't get carved with symbols cut deep enough to outlast the iron they're cut into. And Hiram's training kept trying to file this as a maintenance hatch and kept failing. No pipe ran to this door. No cable, no sump, no conduit of any kind, because this wasn't a utility chamber and never had been. And a sewer man knows the difference between a space built to hold water and a space built to hold something else. And this space had been built to hold something else. He stepped back from the door and looked at the chamber around it. The turning room was dressed stone on every face, fitted dry, no mortar, no keystone, no mark of any trade he knew, and the walls met the floor in a curve instead of a corner, the way a vessel meets its base, and the whole room felt less like a room than like the neck of something larger. One symbol stood out from the rest. It was a hooked mark, like a half-closed eye, cut deeper than the others across the lintel, and Hiram didn't know it yet, but he would see it again inside, cut into stone older than the door, and he would understand then that the same hand had sealed the door and sealed what was behind it. He had a choice at the gap. It was the same choice the men before him had, which was to brick it shut and climb out and never speak of it. And that had been the choice for 150 years. And the door was already ajar, and the glow was already there, and the air was already moving. He told himself he only needed to look. He put his shoulder against the iron, and the door swung inward with a sound like a slow exhale, and the warm light spread across a floor of dressed stone that no map of Chicago had ever shown, because no one who'd seen it had ever drawn it. The room was low and long. Cut from the same dressed stone as the passage, it was older than the freight tunnels by more than the tunnels were older than Hyram, and he could feel it in the cut of the blocks, which had been worked by hand with a patience that didn't belong to a railroad company in a hurry to move coal. The ceiling was close enough he couldn't stand straight. His lamp threw his shadow long across a floor that had been swept clean once and left to the dark for a very long time, and the stillness in there was the kind that has a memory, the same stillness he'd spent 30 years learning to listen to, only deeper. The stone was dry. That was wrong for the depth, because everything this far under Chicago weeps a little. The clay sweats and the joints run, but this stone was bone dry, as if the water had been told to keep away from it, and dry stone at that depth is its own kind of warning. Along the walls were things that didn't belong to any Chicago the history books describe. shapes wrapped in cloth that had gone to leather, and stone vessels cut in forms he didn't recognize, and pieces of worked metal that hadn't rusted the way iron rusts, set into niches as if they'd been put there to wait for someone. Some of the niches were empty. Whatever had been in them was gone, taken or moved or used, and the empty niches bothered him more than the full ones, because a full niche is a thing put away, and an empty niche is a thing that left, and he didn't want to think about where the things that left had gone. He didn't touch any of it. He'd spent enough years underground to know that the things left behind in the dark are left behind for a reason, and the reason is usually the man who finds them. So he kept his hands to himself and let his lamp do the looking. The bones were in the center of the room. They were laid out on a flat stone in a pattern that wasn't a grave, because a grave is a body put down to rest, scattered or curled or laid even, and these were arranged, sorted by type, and set in a design that used the skeleton as a material rather than a person. There were more of them than one body could account for. They were old, older than the founding of Chicago, older than the fur traders who first built on the swamp. The arrangement was the horror of the room, because it told him this wasn't a place where the dead were buried. It was a place where something was done to the dead, and to whatever was meant to stay below them. The pattern pointed at the seam. Every line of the arrangement, every sorted row of bone, directed the eye toward the recess in the far wall where the ember light lived, and Hiram understood, with the slow, cold clarity that comes in rooms like that the bones weren't the point of the room. They were the lock, and the seam was what they were locking. The hooked mark from the door was here too, cut into the stone over the arrangement, in the same hand. It told him that whoever had sealed the door had stood in this room and understood what was in it. They had chosen to wall it up rather than break it open, and now Hiram was standing where that person had stood, looking at what that person had looked at. The glow came from a recess in the far wall. A seam in the stone held the ember light, and as he watched it the light pulsed once, slow, in time with the air, and then it pulsed again, and the arrangement of bones on the stone seemed to shift in his peripheral vision, the way a face shifts in a dark window. He did what a practical man does in an impractical place. He reasoned it through out loud, though there was no one to hear, because the chamber was older than the city, and the city had been raised on jackscrews in the 1850s directly above it, and Chesborough's sewer plan had laid drains and fill right on top of it. The raising of Chicago had always been taught as drainage engineering. It was that, a city lifting itself out of its own swamp, but it was also something else, because a lid is still drainage if you build the drains on top of it, and a man who spends his life in sewers knows exactly what a lid is for. He didn't run. He understood, standing there, why the men who came before had sealed this and walked away, and agreed never to put it on a map, because some things under a city are held rather than solved, and the holding is the work, and it's the work nobody thanks you for. He also understood that what was held hadn't gone. It was only contained, and the door being ajar meant that containing wasn't what it had been, and the ember light pulsing in the seam meant that whatever the lid had been built to keep down was still down there, and still aware of the open door. He backed toward the doorway without turning his lamp off. He moved the way a man moves out of a room that's watching him, slow and even, and he didn't run, because a man who runs in a low stone room splits his head on the ceiling, and because some part of him believed that if he moved calmly the room would let him leave. He stood in the chamber and waited the way a foreman weighs a call. He could go up and tell Dale the truth, and Dale would call the city, and the city would send crews and engineers, and eventually cameras and reporters, and the lid would come off for good and stay off. Or he could do what the men before him had done. He could seal it and carry it and let the city above keep not knowing, the way it hadn't known about its own flooded basements in 1992. And that was the choice that had held the line for 150 years, and it had held it for a reason. He thought about Dale, and about the young crews, and about what would happen to them if it got pried open. They were good men with families, and they'd go down into that chamber the way they went into every collapsed tunnel, with cameras and confidence, and some of them wouldn't come back the same, and Hiram knew that because he wasn't coming back the same, and he'd only been in there for 20 minutes. The hard part was that he understood the men before him, and he hadn't expected to. He'd spent his life assuming the old sealers were superstitious or lazy or just unaware, men of their time who didn't know better, and standing in the warm air of that room, he didn't think they were unaware at all. He thought they understood something about what sits under a living city. The living city is safer not knowing it, and he thought they were probably right, and that was the part that sat heavy, because he'd never thought of himself as a man who would agree to a secret, and now he was about to become one. He thought about his father too then. The old man had carried something like this his whole career, Hiram realized. The same quiet weight, the same way of not quite answering when you asked him about the job. He'd spent his life thinking his father was just a tired man, and now he understood his father had been a man holding a door shut with his mind. The cost was clear. He'd have to lie about what was down here, the way the old maps lied, and he'd carry it for whatever years he had left. And it would be the thing he couldn't tell his wife, and couldn't tell Dale, and couldn't tell the men who came after him. This was what made the last generation stop talking. It wasn't weakness. It was the weight of a thing that gets heavier every time you hold it, and that you can't set down in front of anyone. And Hiram had judged those men his whole career for their silence, and now he was joining them, and the joining felt less like a failure than like an initiation. He did one thing in the room before he left. He took nothing and he changed nothing, because a photograph is a map, and he decided there would be no map, so he didn't photograph the bones, or the marks, or the ember light, and he left the arrangement exactly as it had held itself for longer than Chicago had existed. He pulled the door shut behind him. He wedged it with the fallen stone from the passage, so it held the way it had held before, and he bricked the spur back up at the Grand Union with the materials Dale's crew had left stacked for exactly this kind of closure, working fast, before the weight of what he was sealing could change his mind. By the time he climbed out, the wall the crew wouldn't pass was a wall again. The only evidence of the chamber was one old man with a memory he wasn't going to use, and he walked back up the passage with the ember light behind him and the silence ahead of him, and the silence was the older of the two. He stopped once on the climb up and looked back down the passage. The dark behind him was complete, and the bricked wall was already just a wall again, and he told himself that was enough, that a wall was a wall, and that what was behind it would hold as long as men like him kept agreeing that it should. He surfaced at dawn. The streets were already loud with traffic, and the city above didn't know what it was standing on, and Hiram stood in the cold air for a long minute and let the noise wash over him like a thing he'd borrowed and had to give back. Dale asked him what was down there. Hiram gave him the answer that goes into the report, that it was a collapsed spur of the old freight tunnels, unstable, and that he recommended bricking it off. And they bricked it off, and Dale looked at him like he wanted to ask more, and then didn't. He went home and told his wife the survey was done. He retired for good, and the maps in his head stayed in his head, and he never went underground again. And when young crews from the city came to ask him about the old tunnels, he told them what the map said, and nothing else. The city was built twice, and the second time was a lid, and the lid is still holding because everyone agreed not to lift it. The next collapse is only a matter of time, because the ground under Chicago has never been as empty as the maps say. Subscribe to The Voice of the Hollow for more stories the cities tried to keep sealed, and I'll see you down in the dark next time.